The Witch Hunter's Last Confession, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Witch in Chains. Corwin's point of view. The torches burned low as Corwin descended the cathedral steps. Each stone underfoot was older than the crown itself, worn smooth by centuries of priests and inquisitors pacing the same descent. The air grew colder, thinner. Holy ground had long since given way to something deeper, something that whispered behind the walls if one stood still too long. He didn't stop. They'd locked her in the lowest cell, past the screaming ones, past the mad witches who still sobbed to their gods through iron bars. The guards had sealed the hallway with prayer cloth and iron rings, but even those had begun to curl at the edges, burned from within. The Blood Witch waited beyond them, the crown's final prize. The one they called Severia of the Red Veil, though no veil remained on her now. The iron door moaned open. She didn't look up. She was seated on the floor in chains, her wrists and ankles cuffed, a rune-marked collar around her throat. Her hair hung like spilled ink down her back, untouched by the filth around her. Barefoot, blood-smeared, pale skin traced with sigils that pulsed softly with some internal light like embers beneath ash. The worst of them circled her left arm, an ancient blood glyph that looked like it had been carved, not painted. She lifted her eyes when he stepped inside. There was no plea in them, no rage, just stillness. Strange colored irises, dark red edged with gold, caught the dim torchlight and made him forget, for half a breath, how to breathe. Corwin had interrogated witches before. He'd broken their lies beneath iron, salt, and scripture. He had watched them scream when the fire came, but this one did not scream. "You know who I am," he said, though the words tasted hollow. Her gaze slid over him. "The King's Butcher, yes." The voice was unexpected. Low, rich, feminine, without softness. It rang through the chamber not like a threat, but a verdict. He stepped forward, forcing detachment to settle over his shoulders like armor. The crown had ordered her executed at dawn. His task was to ensure the public spectacle proceeded without surprises. That meant a confession. Something to read as they burned her alive. "What you carry inside you," he said carefully, "is the last of a heresy that predates our kingdom. The people deserve the truth, not another witch's silence." She laughed once. It was not warm. "The people were fed their truth long ago. You're only here to give it a pretty ending." He crouched in front of her. She smelled of rust and crushed herbs and something older, colder. The sigil on her arm pulsed again. He didn't mean to reach out, but his fingers brushed the mark and the world recoiled. The glyph blazed. A rush of heat seared through his palm. Red light flashed across the chamber, and the air tore like parchment. Something unseen screamed through the stone, and the walls shuddered. The sigil unfurled itself, climbing from her arm onto his. He couldn't pull back. The mark seared into his flesh like a brand, winding up his arm, crawling toward his heart. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was too complete. He staggered back, clutching his wrist. It throbbed, not in pain, but in recognition. She was watching him now, still bound, but her mouth curved in something like grief. "You touched it," she said, not surprised. "Now you're mine." The door behind him crashed open. 2 guards stormed in, weapons drawn. But as they crossed the threshold, the glyph on Corwin's arm lit up again, bright, violent. The guards froze mid-step, unable to move further. One tried to speak, but no sound came. They looked at him with horror, not at the witch. Severia exhaled slowly, as if a storm had passed. "You don't understand what you've done, do you?" Corwin's voice was ash in his throat. "You cursed me." "No." Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I bound you. My magic protects itself now, and you, She tilted her head, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. "You're part of that protection." He looked down at the still glowing sigil on his wrist. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat. His armor felt too tight, his skin too warm. "You're lying," he said, though it was weaker than before. "I wish I were," she whispered. "But if they burn me now, you burn with me. The mark won't let me die unless you do." The guards were still frozen in place, afraid, not of her, of him, of what the glyph meant, of what he was now. He turned back to Severia. "You did this to escape." She didn't blink. "No. I did this to live long enough to stop what's coming." He wanted to scream. He wanted to drag her out and end it the way he'd ended all the others. But something in his blood rebelled. Not guilt. Not yet. But dissonance. Confusion. A slow crumble in the foundation that had kept him upright for years. "You've been told magic is corruption," she said quietly. "But they never told you what it used to be. What we were for." Her voice was steady, but her body was trembling slightly now. Fatigue, he realized, or maybe cold. No heat reached these cells. She'd been shackled in the dark for weeks. And still she looked at him not with desperation, but with the weary patience of someone waiting for a condemned man to catch up. He couldn't stay, not with the mark flaring like fire in his veins. He turned without speaking. The guard stepped back as he passed, faces pale. They didn't try to stop him. Outside the chamber, he closed the iron door and pressed his back to the wall. He stared at his hand. The sigil remained dim but alive. He felt her still. The warmth of her skin. The echo of her breath. Corwin Vale, Inquisitor of the Crown, had come to extract a confession. Instead, he'd become the final page in a book he didn't understand. And the witch in chains wasn't waiting to be saved, and she was waiting to be followed. Chapter 2. The Sigil's Bond. Corwin's point of view. Corwin had always trusted the cold, the clean chill of the marble altars, the bite of steel against his fingers as he polished the blade before an execution, the frost in his veins that let him watch a witch burn and feel nothing at all. The cold kept him sane. But the warmth under his skin now, it wasn't his. It pulsed just below the surface of his forearm, winding like a second heartbeat around his bones. The Blood Witch's mark, her curse, her brand. It responded when he thought of her, flared gently when her voice echoed in his mind. Even now, hours later, beneath the sacred vaults of the Inquisition, it hummed like a candle kept too close to dry parchment. He hadn't reported it. Instead, he'd returned to his chambers, bolted the door, and stripped off his armor with shaking hands. He sat on the floor like a drunk and stared at the mark twisting up his arm, red, raw, and oddly beautiful. Not like the corrupt sigils painted by hedge witches to hex crops or seduce magistrates. No, this was old, carved with precision and intent. Not wild magic. Ritual. As the dawn bell tolled high above the cathedral, he still hadn't slept. She would be burned in hours, and if what she'd said was true, the fire would take him too. He should have reported the mark, let the High Inquisitor see it, diagnose it, burn it out of him, but something stopped him. Something wordless. Not fear. Something closer to hesitation. A quiet, growing question that he couldn't name, much less answer. By the time he descended again into the underlevels, he had already rehearsed a dozen reasons for his return. He needed clarification for the public confession. He needed to inspect her bindings. He needed to understand. But when he opened the door to her cell, none of those reasons mattered. She was standing now, shackled but tall. Her eyes turned to him immediately, as if she had known the exact moment he would appear. There was no surprise in her gaze, only recognition. The sigil on his arm brightened slightly in her presence, and her lips curved, not into a smile, but something more complex. It felt disturbingly like welcome. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, though there was no true reproach in her voice. Corwin stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air seemed heavier again, thick with invisible threads. She hadn't moved from the spot, but the space around her felt different, less like a prison, and more like the center of something very old and very still. A shrine desecrated but not broken. "What is this bond?" he asked finally, voice lower than intended. "Why did it choose me?" She tilted her head. "You touched a living seal. They're meant to bind guardians, not enemies. I'm not your guardian." "No," she said. "Not yet." He should have laughed or cursed. Instead, he watched the slow, precise way she breathed. Every movement she made felt deliberate, as if she were a ritual in motion. "How long have you been down here?" he asked. She looked toward the single crack in the stone, where a sliver of daylight bled through. "Since the last ward broke beneath the Chapel of Salt. A month. Maybe 2. Time fades in the dark." Corwin stepped closer, slowly. The mark on his arm tingled. Not painful, but intimate, like a hand brushing along his nerves. "They say you massacred an entire regiment," he said, watching her carefully. "Left nothing but red ash." She turned her head toward him. "Do I look like I could?" And she didn't. She looked like she'd been starved, restrained, drained of all power. Her collar pulsed faintly where the metal met skin, likely suppressing her strength. But her eyes never lost focus. Even now, chained and doomed, she studied him like she could see every crack inside him. "Why would the crown lie?" he asked, though the question came out smaller than intended. She blinked slowly, and for a heartbeat her expression shifted, something close to pity. "You really don't know," she murmured. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't a game. It was sadness. That's what struck him most. Not her power or her blood-marked skin, but the quiet sorrow in her voice when she realized how deeply he believed in something that had never been real. Corwin took another step forward. The air between them warmed. The mark on his skin brightened once more. "You were meant to be one of us," she said, almost to herself. "Lies," he whispered, but the word fell flat, because deep in the marrow of him something stirred. A distant ache. A whisper from memory. His mother's hands marked with patterns he'd never understood. His father's warning not to speak of them to the priests. He had thought they were just stories. Strange family quirks best forgotten. She saw it in his face. Her voice dropped to a hush. "You've always felt it, haven't you? The part of you that never fit, that stayed cold no matter how many you burned." He didn't answer. In the silence that followed, something trembled beneath the floor. A low, almost inaudible groan in the stone. It passed beneath them like a shadow too large for the world. Corwin flinched and Severia's eyes narrowed. "It's waking faster than I thought," she said. "What is?" She didn't answer. Just stepped back, pulling the chain taut between them. The light from the glyph cast faint reflections across her face. "If I die," she said, "there will be no one left to keep it from rising. And if I let you live, the city burns anyway?" Her gaze was steady. "Not if you help me stop it." He wanted to leave, wanted the door to open and his thoughts to still. But he remained where he was, caught in the heat of the glyph, in the unbearable nearness of a woman who should have been his enemy. Corwin Vale had come here to ensure her death. Instead, he watched her watch him, and wondered if his fate had been written not in ink, but in blood, long before he was ever born. And for the first time in years he felt afraid, not of her, of what he was becoming. Chapter 3. Fire Without Flame. Corwin's Point of View. The city bells rang just before dawn, their solemn toll echoing over the rooftops and through the winding streets of Armathan, like a death sentence already passed. The square was being prepared for a public execution, the crowd restless even before sunrise. They always gathered early for witches. It gave them a sense of righteousness to watch someone else's sins burn. Corwin stood behind the cathedral gates, untouched by the commotion, cloaked in a heavy wool mantle that concealed both his face and the mark now etched into his arm. He hadn't reported it. He hadn't gone to High Inquisitor Gresham. He hadn't even told the guards. And something in him had split open in that cell, and the part of him that once followed orders without hesitation had gone silent. Severia was no longer below the cathedral. She walked beside him now, hidden under a prisoner's hood, her hands bound in front of her. But the chains were an illusion. They rattled, but did not hold. He had unlocked her hours ago, and whispered a name he hadn't spoken aloud since childhood. Ashera. She'd gone still then, lips parted, eyes wide. She said that was the name of the old rites, the forgotten guardian he should have been. He didn't know why he remembered it. All he knew was that he couldn't burn her. The sigil wouldn't let him. Neither would something deeper. The body they burned wouldn't be hers. He had paid the undertaker in silence and coin, retrieved a corpse too disfigured to identify, and dressed it in Severia's robes. The execution would go on as planned. The crown would see smoke. The people would see justice. And Corwin Vale would disappear with a woman who was supposed to be dead. They moved quickly through the cathedral's lower halls, taking a path few living remembered. The doors to the ossuary yawned open before them, ancient, dust-choked, heavy with the scent of ash and old bones. The passage curved down like a serpent's spine, leading them away from the world above. The first hour passed in silence, then the next. The air turned colder. Severia never stumbled, never asked where they were going. She walked beside him, quiet but alert. Her presence unnerving in how little fear she showed. Her collar still glinted faintly with control runes, but she no longer flinched when it hummed. "You planned this," he said, at last, not looking at her. "No," she replied, "but I waited for someone who might." The way she said it made something twist low in his gut. Not longing, not trust. Something sharper. Something that knew they were still not on the same side. The catacombs widened into a circular chamber, the ceiling high and cracked with age. Stained glass remnants glowed faintly from broken arches above. Corwin paused, scanning for the half-sealed door he'd once passed during a failed raid. The old shrine was here, somewhere beneath this ruin. Severia stopped behind him. He felt her eyes on his back. "You still don't believe me," she said, and there was no challenge in her tone, just truth. "I believe the mark burns when you're near," he said. "I believe the ground moves when you speak the old words. But belief is not trust." "You'll need both," she murmured. He found the door, wedged in stone, carved with symbols nearly worn away. He pressed his hand to it and felt it shift. A groan of old wood, and it opened. Beyond it was a chamber unlike the rest. The shrine was collapsed in parts with roots pushing through the floor, and old statues fallen in pieces. But the air was different, warmer. Not from fire, but from something deeper. A pressure behind the eyes, a hum in the blood. Severia stepped inside first. The glyph on Corwin's arm surged like it recognized the place. She moved to the center of the chamber and knelt. Her hands brushed the earth reverently. The chains fell away, without ceremony. He watched her fingertips dig into the dirt like it mattered, like it answered. Then she began to bleed, not from a wound, from her palms. Thin lines of red that rose like mist, floating upward and curling into the sigils already glowing on her arms. The sight made his chest tighten. "What are you doing?" "Slowing it down," she said without looking at him. "The wound beneath the city. The seal is cracked. We're walking on borrowed time." He stepped closer, drawn despite himself. Her hair was fanned out around her, catching the crimson light like strands of fire. The air between them felt heavy again. The bond was awake. "You were never meant to be hunted," he said, the words pulled from a place he'd locked away. "You were meant to protect." She looked up and something in her expression wavered. The pain was still there, buried deep. But now there was something else behind it. Not vulnerability. Not hope. Recognition. I still can, she said softly, but not alone. He reached for her. He didn't mean to. He told himself it was instinct, to steady her, to see if she was weakening. But the moment his hand met her shoulder, the bond between them flared like a flare beneath the skin, and he felt it. Her breath catch, his pulse trip, the quiet ache between them that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the way they had begun orbiting each other without ever intending to. For a moment, he stood too close. As the ruin flickered around them like a dying candle, her eyes met his. His hand didn't move, the silence thickened, and then she looked away and the moment slipped, like ash through fingers. The blood lifted higher, glowing brighter. She whispered something in a language he didn't know, and the lines faded, swallowed into the earth. The ritual ended. She slumped slightly, breath uneven. He caught her without thinking, his arm circling her waist. Her body was warm, too warm. Her skin shivered beneath his touch. You shouldn't have wasted that much blood, he murmured, steadier than he felt. She leaned against him briefly. I wasn't wasting it. They stood like that longer than they should have, no words, no more questions. Just the quiet thrum of the bond between them, pulsing like a secret that didn't want to stay hidden. Far above, the city would be watching a body burn. Down here, beneath the ruined shrine, something else was beginning to burn too. And Corwin Vale, the man who had never believed in anything but orders, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. He didn't trust her, but he didn't want to let her go. Chapter 4. The Shrine of Thorns. Corwin's point of view. The ruin had no name now. Whatever it had once been, temple, altar, sanctum, had long since been erased. Moss grew from cracks in the altar stones, and vines, pale and skeletal, reached across the ceiling like the veins trying to pull the sky down. A shattered mural lay beneath their feet, its symbols faded, ground under the boots of soldiers who'd once marched through these halls when the crown first declared magic a heresy. Corwin sat near the broken wall, sharpening a blade that no longer felt like it belonged to him. The weight was familiar, but everything else was shifting. The room still held the taste of Severia's blood ritual, metallic and fragrant, thick with memory. The glyph on his arm had gone quiet, but he could feel its tether tightening, subtly rearranging the space between them. She hadn't spoken in hours. She sat by the dead brazier, legs folded beneath her, hair fanned over one shoulder, and stared into the ashes like they might reveal the future. Her sleeves were torn from the right. The sigils on her arms were dim now, but they left shadows on the inside of his skull. He couldn't look at them without feeling something shift under his skin. He told himself the silence was strategic, that they were fugitives in enemy territory, and that staying quiet was survival. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just the risk. He didn't know what to say to her anymore. Not after the way her body had leaned into his. Not after the sound of her breath stuttering as the blood left her palms. Not after that near touch that hadn't crossed the line. But could have. The worst part was how easy it had become to forget what side he was on. The fire they'd lit was small and hidden behind stacked stone, fed with broken wood and dust. It flickered just enough to warm the edge of the room, but not enough to draw attention. Outside the ruin, the forest whispered with wind and old bones, too quiet for any comfort. When Severia finally moved, it was slow, like she was waking from something ancient. She stood, crossing to the pool where rainwater had gathered. Without a word, she dipped her hands into the basin and unwrapped the makeshift bandages he'd tied around her palms hours earlier. The water pinked, blood unwound like silk, and she was still bleeding. You didn't stop it, he said, and it came out sharper than he meant. He hated how tightly his voice clung to her silence. She looked over her shoulder. The mark chooses its price. He stood, walking toward her, the sword forgotten. The sigil on his arm began to hum again. It always knew when she was near. You'll weaken if you keep spilling yourself into the earth. I'm not trying to be strong, she said, not turning. I'm trying to hold the seal. One breath longer, one crack tighter. He stared at her reflection in the water. She looked softer there, blurred and flickering, almost human. "You're not alone anymore." The word surprised him. They sat heavy between them, heavier than anything he'd said before. She stilled, hands dripping, and finally turned to face him. Her expression didn't change, not exactly, but something in her eyes flickered, caution, and something deeper. She looked at him not as an inquisitor or a threat, but as a man bound to her by a fate neither of them had chosen. Then she stepped forward on only a pace, but it felt like a decision. The fire behind them cast long shadows dancing across the stone. Her skin shimmered faintly, the sigils like faint constellations across her arms and collarbones. The collar around her throat had stopped glowing. It was dormant now, or perhaps she had learned to mute it. He didn't ask. She reached out slowly and touched the inside of his forearm just above the mark. The contact was light, barely more than a breath, but the glyph answered. It flared beneath his skin, not with pain but with heat. It flooded his chest with a sensation that was not desire, not magic, not fear, but all of them tangled into something more primal, the kind of bond that needed no words. She didn't pull away. "You feel it too," she said softly, as if testing a truth she wasn't sure he'd admit. He didn't. He only watched her hand as it lingered, and then he stepped closer. Their proximity became a language. The scent of her, wild herbs, iron, something dark and spiced, filled the air between them. Her eyes lifted, meeting his, and neither of them looked away. Corwin had touched death many times in his life. He had burned women who screamed they were innocent, silenced men who wept for their daughters, followed orders so holy they had left him hollow. He had felt nothing. But this woman, this mark, this silence between them, this meant something, and it terrified him. He raised a hand slowly and let his fingers rest just beneath her jaw. Her skin was warm, almost feverish, and she didn't flinch. Her breath hitched, barely, and her lashes lowered. He felt the tremor that moved through her, a silent exhale that reached deeper than air. Still, neither of them moved to close the distance. It was too soon, it was not enough, and it was already too much, and they broke apart with no sound, as if some unspoken edge had been reached and neither of them dared fall over it. The fire cracked behind them, sending sparks up like dying stars. Severia turned back toward the wall, wrapping her arms around herself, the blood still seeping gently from her hands. She didn't speak again. Neither did he. Corwin returned to his place, by the broken wall, and sat down with the sword across his knees. But he didn't touch it. He stared into the shadows where she now stood, half illuminated, half lost. He could feel her breath across the bond. He could feel her exhaustion, her loneliness, her rage. And he knew, without needing her to say it, that this was the closest she had come to trusting someone in a very long time. It would not last. But for now, in the ruins of a forgotten shrine beneath a dying city, it was enough. And it was dangerous. Chapter 5. Betrayer's Confession. Corwin's point of view. The storm broke without warning. Corwin heard it first, thunder rolling like distant drums, low and relentless, the kind of sound that didn't belong to sky or weather. It rumbled beneath the earth, echoing off the stones of the ruin as if the gods themselves stirred in restless sleep. Rain followed next, not gentle or rhythmic, but violent, battering the ancient stone like fists. Somewhere, the seal below was shifting again. He stood at the edge of the shrine's outer arch, watching rain darken the moss and roots. Water streamed in through the cracks, flooding the basin where Severia had bled the night before. He should have gone back inside, but the air out here was easier to breathe, cooler against his skin. Inside, she slept. He had stood guard through the night, not because she asked him to, but because sleep no longer came. He watched her now through the half-collapsed archway. She lay curled near the brazier, wrapped in his cloak, hair scattered across the stone like ink spilled in water. The collar no longer pulsed. Her breathing was even. For a moment, she didn't look like a weapon or a witch, just a woman, one who had lost too much and dared trust too little, and still she had let him touch her. That thought hadn't left him since the moment her fingers had brushed the mark. It lingered even now. A sensation folded deep in his skin, as if her presence had changed the shape of his very breath. He wanted to ignore it, to erase it like every feeling before. But he couldn't. He stepped back into the ruin and set down the satchel he'd found near the old camp, the remains of a long-forgotten altar guard supply. He'd hoped for food. Instead, he found records. Rotting scrolls stained with blood and dirt. Names. Symbols. Not in the Crown's dialect. In the older tongue. Her tongue. He hadn't meant to pry, but when he unrolled the scroll with shaking hands and saw his family's name, everything else fell silent. Vale, scrawled in red ink beside the glyph for guardian, his father's name, and his mother's. A mark beside them, too faded to read. Severia stirred as he sat near the fire, scroll still clenched in his fist. She didn't speak, only watched. "You knew," he said, voice hoarse. "You knew my family wasn't loyal to the Crown." She pushed herself upright, the cloak slipping from one shoulder. Her skin was pale against the firelight, and the sigils on her arm glowed faintly where they touched the hem. Her expression was unreadable. "I suspected," she said finally. "When you said the name Asherah, only those raised in the old houses would have known it. And you didn't think to tell me?" He tossed the scroll down between them. The symbols looked darker now, more real. "You let me believe I was nothing but a weapon for their cause." "You were," she said, too calmly, "but not by choice." Her voice didn't carry anger, only a weary certainty that dug deeper than accusation. "I watched my parents burn for harboring a witch," he said quietly. "That's what they told me. They said my mother begged for mercy, that she confessed under sacred flame. I stood in that square as a child and heard them call her a traitor. I believed them." The room felt colder now, even the fire seemed to draw back. "They lied to you," she said, her voice lower now. "Your mother was a keeper of the fourth shrine. She bore the sigils of protection. She wouldn't have confessed to lies." Corwin's hands trembled. He clenched them into fists. "I've killed for them. I've burned people like her, like you." Severia didn't flinch. She pulled the cloak tighter around herself and looked directly at him. "I know." That was all. No judgment. No pity. Just knowing. And somehow, it made everything worse. The rain outside deepened. The shrine echoed with water dripping through the cracks. He stared into the fire and tried to piece himself back together. But nothing fit anymore. He felt her move then, felt it before he saw it, the way the sigil on his arm warmed, the way the air shifted. She knelt beside him slowly, cautiously, her bare knee brushing his boot. He didn't look at her, not until her hand found his forearm again. The contact was soft, grounding. No magic, just touch. He looked at her, and her eyes were tired but not unkind. "We're both marked," she said. "Both made into something we didn't choose. But you're here now. You stayed. You didn't have to." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "And if I still don't believe I'm worth saving?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "Then I'll believe it enough for both of us." It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, something raw and dangerous and just barely alive. A flicker of warmth in the bones of something long dead. She leaned into him, not fully, just enough that their shoulders touched. It felt like a decision she was still daring herself to make. He didn't pull away, didn't move. Just let her be near. For a long time, they said nothing. The rain dulled to a soft hiss beyond the broken stone. The fire cracked low between them. Somewhere beneath, the seal still trembled. But in this moment, beneath this roofless ruin, it was quiet. She closed her eyes. And he did too. Because for the first time since he'd touched that mark, Corwin Vale didn't feel like a weapon or a traitor. or a child still chasing the ghosts of what he was told to be. For the first time, he just felt real. And beside him, so did she. Chapter 6. The Door Beneath the City. Corwin's Point of View. By the time they returned to the city, it no longer felt like a home. The spires of Armathan rose through a sky thick with smoke and stormlight, their white stones streaked black by the soot of old pyres. Rain clung to the rooftops like oil. The bells had stopped ringing days ago. The streets were quieter now, but not peaceful. Emptier, like something sacred had already begun to rot and the city hadn't found the words for its grief. Corwin kept to the alley shadows, Severia close beside him, her cloak soaked through. The mark on his arm had burned steadily the closer they drew to the heart of the capital, as though the seal buried beneath the city had begun to pull them both in. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer held the sharpness it once had. It had changed, grown warmer, more intimate, threaded through with unsaid thoughts, too fragile to name. Sometimes she brushed his arm when they walked too close. Sometimes he lingered just a little longer, when handing her a canteen or offering a hand up the slick stones. Nothing had passed between them beyond touch, but the wanting lived just under the skin, soft and slow and constant. They moved like a single shape now, alert, invisible, fused by something neither of them had asked for and neither could abandon. Beneath the chapel of the sacred dead, hidden behind layers of ash and scripture, was a sealed stair they were never meant to find. Corwin had only heard whispers of it, and those were usually spoken by drunk soldiers on the wrong side of midnight, rumors of a door beneath the crypts, locked with blood and silence. They found it as the last torch sputtered out. Carved into the stone below the cathedral's vaults, the door was twice his height and utterly smooth. No handle, no lock. Just an ancient circle in its center, etched in a pattern that matched the one now burned into his arm. When he reached for it, the sigil answered. The door didn't creak or groan, it simply opened like it had been waiting. The space beyond was colder than death. A corridor lined in black stone, lit by nothing, and yet they could see. Not with their eyes. With the bond. Severia walked ahead without hesitation, barefoot now, the hem of her cloak trailing over bone-white dust. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with pressure. His lungs resisted it. His skin prickled. The corridor ended in a vast chamber, circular, cathedral-high, its walls embedded with relics from a time before language, shards of sigils, stone runes, bones carved with prayers. At the center stood a platform, raised and cracked as if something had tried to break out from beneath. This was the wound at the seal, the thing her blood had been holding back. Corwin could feel it humming beneath his boots, an endless, coiled hunger. Not a creature, not a demon. Something older. Something that remembered the shape of creation and wanted it undone. Severia stepped forward. Her breath left her in one slow exhale, and when she looked back at him, he saw none of the brittle pride from their first meeting. She looked tired. Honest. I can close it, she said, her voice barely audible, but it'll take all that's left of me. His heart moved, sharp, unbidden. He stepped onto the platform. There's another way. She smiled, and it broke something in him, because it wasn't a smile of hope. It was farewell. You would die for this, she asked. I would die for you. It wasn't loud, it wasn't planned, but the truth of it echoed louder than the chamber itself. She froze. For a second, the world narrowed to the space between them. Then the seal shifted. The floor cracked, and a wave of force hit them both. Corwin staggered. Severia dropped to her knees, clutching her ribs as the glyph on her skin blazed like flame. Something beneath the seal was waking. He moved to her side instantly, pulling her upright. Her body trembled in his arms, too hot, too fragile. I'll do it, he said. You taught me how to bleed for something, let me give it back. She shook her head. This magic, it knows me. It wants me. Then take me with you. She laughed through a breathless gasp. That's not how it works. And still, she leaned in. Her lips brushed his temple, a kiss that wasn't about passion or possession but memory, a promise of something that could have been, would have been, should have been. He closed his eyes. Then footsteps echoed across the stone, and they turned together. From the corridor, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in silver robes bearing the insignia of the crown. High Inquisitor Gresham. He walked with the calm of someone who had always known how this would end. I wondered how long it would take you to find your heritage, Gresham said. The glyph suits you, Corwin. Your mother would be proud. Or she would have, if she hadn't been a traitor. Corwin stepped in front of Severia, sword already drawn. His blood sang. The glyph pulsed. You knew the seal was breaking. Of course, Gresham said. It's not breaking, boy. We're opening it. Severia's breath caught behind him. You want to release it? Gresham smiled. Not release. Harness. We can't kill the gods of the old blood, but we can chain them and use their hunger to bend the world. The fire was never about purging magic. It was about preparing the vessel. He looked at Severia, and she is perfect. Corwin lunged. The sword struck steel, then flesh. Gresham staggered, blood blooming across his robes, but he was already smiling. The chamber cracked again. The wound beneath them pulsed, furious now, drawn by the scent of blood, by the lies, by the truth laid bare. Severia rose, and she was shaking, but her voice was steady. Then let it take me, she whispered. Let it end with me. Corwin grabbed her hand. No, he said, let it end with us. The glyph answered. Light poured from them both, not fire but memory, not pain but surrender. As the seal broke open, they stepped forward together. Chapter 7. Let the city burn. Corwin's point of view. The first thing he felt was warmth. Not flame, not pain, but the kind of warmth that came from blood shared, breath held, a name spoken into the silence of death and heard. His hand was still wrapped around hers, their palms pressed together over the heart of the seal. Her skin glowed with the same light as the glyph on his arm, no longer separate. One mark shared between them. One wound. The chamber around them was gone. At least the walls had dissolved into something he couldn't see, light without source, space without weight. The platform beneath their feet cracked open, the stone fading into nothingness, and yet they did not fall. Severia stood beside him, barefoot, pale, streaked with blood, but unafraid. She wasn't looking at the wound. She was looking at him. Her fingers tightened against his. I didn't think you'd follow me here, she whispered, voice soft as smoke. Corwin didn't answer. There was nothing left to say, because the truth was already in his body, in the way he'd given up the sword, the silence, the city, for the chance to stand beside her now. He hadn't understood her at first. He'd been trained to fear her, to destroy her, and still somehow she had undone him without ever meaning to. She had taken him apart not through seduction or spell, but through presence, through every truth she refused to hide, every breath she spent holding the seal together while the world hated her for it. She was a flame that never asked for kindling, and he had fallen into her light. Beneath their feet, the seal surged one last time and then broke. Not with an explosion, not with screaming, it was quieter than that. Like exhaling. Like a sigh from something too tired to go on. The ground buckled, then stilled. Corwin braced himself for agony. For the end. But the mark on their skin didn't burn. It brightened. The sigils they shared bled together, one line after another, until they weren't glyphs anymore. Just light. And with that light, something shifted in the air around them. Not destruction. Release. The hunger in the earth, the wound, the old god, the thing that had waited centuries to be fed. It wasn't devouring them. It was freeing them. She turned to him then, and he caught her in his arms without thinking, without hesitation. Her body folded into his like it had always known the shape of him. She was trembling, not with fear, but with the aftermath of something ancient loosening its hold. She pressed her forehead to his. "Is it over?" she asked. He didn't know. He didn't care. He kissed her. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't wild. It was slow, steady, a confirmation of everything that had led them here. The weight of nights spent in silence, the brush of hands across a skin not yet touched, the ache of a bond neither of them had asked for and both had chosen to keep. Her lips were warm, tasting of iron and ash and something sweeter beneath. She kissed him back like he was the last prayer she would ever speak. And for a moment there was no crown, no inquisition, no gods buried beneath the city. Just her, just him, and just the space between them finally closed. When they pulled apart, the light around them had begun to dim. The seal had collapsed into itself. There was no vault, no platform, only broken stone beneath their feet, and the distant sound of water dripping through hollowed earth. Above, the city still stood. No fire, no collapse. The storm had passed. Armathan had been spared. Not by a blade, not by a crown, but by a witch and a hunter who had stopped pretending they were enemies. Corwin wrapped his cloak around her bare shoulders and she leaned into him without a word. They climbed out together. By the time they reached the surface, the sun had broken through the clouds. The sky over Armathan was gold and gray, and for once, no bells rang. The people wouldn't know what had nearly consumed them. They would believe the execution had worked, that justice had been served, that their city had been purified. Let them believe it. Corwin had no place among them anymore, and neither did she. They left that night. No one saw them go. No one followed. Only the glyph remained, glowing faintly beneath their skin, a silent echo of the seal that would never rise again. They traveled east through forests neither of them had named, into the mountains where shrines lay untouched, and the stars were still remembered by their old names. They didn't speak often. They didn't need to. The bond carried what words could not. She smiled more, now. Not often. But when she did, it made his chest ache. And some nights when the fire was low and the world had gone still, he would reach for her in the dark. She would come to him, slowly, deliberately, and rest her head against his chest. Her breath would steady. His hand would trace the line of her spine like a vow. They didn't talk of what might come. They had already given everything once, and now they were simply alive. And for Corwin Vale, the Inquisitor who had once burned witches in the name of a god that never answered. That was more than enough. The end.